Hi folks, welcome to Better Boston Arts, the interview series asking experts how the Boston art scene can rebuild after the coronavirus pandemic. I'm DigBoston executive editor Jason Pramas, and today I'm talking to Jamaica Plain-based multimedia artist Michael Lewy. Hi Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so in the text version of these interviews, I don't ask people to go on at much length about themselves, but here I really like people to. So please tell us about yourself and what you do as an artist and otherwise.
Sure. So I do quite a few different things. I'm going to say I'm a multimedia artist, but I use photography. I make video art. I also work in computers and do computer graphics.
Oh, cool.
And I've been experimenting with some augmented reality and virtual reality.
I've done some of that.
I'm kind of like, I would say that I'm sort of whatever, I'm a project-based artist. So I think that whatever it takes to sort of like do what I need to do, I use or try to figure out or learn. Sometimes the learning curve can be really hard. But lately the past 5 years, I've been working on a project called Bigfoot Island. And it's sort of a study of all the TV shows I watched as a kid, growing up in the 70s, like Lost in Space and Star Trek and all those crazy.
I think we're about the same age, so this is going to be fun. So, I am ready to go.
Totally dating myself. Space 1999. My wife is younger, and she's always like, what are these shows? Where did they come from? So, the idea was basically that a lot of these images still stuck with me as, I don't know, the weird images of like, I always remember this scene from Lost in Space where they're traveling through this bridge in the middle of space, and it's just a conveyor belt with some fog and Christmas tree lights. And I love the simplicity of that. And I never understood, I still don't really know why these images have like stuck with me to this day. So I started to sort of recreate those things using a lot of analog special effects. And I use myself because that's all I have, and it's easy for me to film myself. So, and I have a green screen in my studio, and so I've been making these little vignettes, and it's sort of like a lost TV show from the 70s. But it's very non-narrative, and I do like 15-second videos, and I string them together, and it sort of makes this total non-narrative of like these lost memories.
Nice. Our film editor Jake Mulligan at Dig has been is good about reviewing and discussing nonlinear filmmaking and other kinds of image making. Yeah, sounds cool.
Oh, thanks.
Where we might as well ask now. Where does one check that work out or your work? Currently?
I have some stuff. I have a lot of stuff on Instagram. At MLEWY, and then I have a website which is michaellewy.com.
Great. So, and I mean, I can also ask, did you grow up around here, or did you grow up somewhere else?
I was born in New Jersey, and then around the third grade, we moved to the Cape. So I grew up on the Cape, and then I went to school a few years in Pennsylvania, and then I came back to Boston and never left. So I've been here since like 1985, which is
a while. Yeah,
I'm dating myself now. So I've been here a really long time, and I've been living in Jamaica Plain a really long time too. I loved Jamaica Plain, so
I've lived there on and off. Yeah, although now I've been north of the river most of the time. And I'm native and I'm 54, so yeah, it's like to date myself, born in '66. So, and what got you into the arts to begin with?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think that I've always had sort of an artist mentality. I mean, I grew up on the Cape, and I remember being a little kid, and I talk about this a little bit in my statement, and I would make like spaceships in my closet, and I was always like constructing or trying to build things. We had a little barn off of our property on the Cape, which was this ramshackle, crazy, like old building that was probably way too dangerous to play in. And I remember going in there and like trying to like make go-karts with like I'd have like 2 wheels and no axle, and so I've always sort of like made things. And in high school I really got into photography.
Right.
like it was really like sort of a savior for me in high school. It just was like opened up a whole new world. So like on and off, I've always been doing photography, and I got my grad degree at Mass Art in the photography program.
You did, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got mine at AIB, and the degree is visual arts. I came in as a photographer. I left as a, I don't know, like you,
Yeah.
research artist, project artist, whatever. You know that. I don't know. Like it's, cool. All right. So might as well just ease right into sort of
Sure.
the main discussion. So you've been around the Boston area art scene for a while, and I always ask folks like what kind of problems did you see, and structural problems, and also individually too, in that scene or scenes, that bothered you.
I think that Boston's a tough city. I think that it's like I was saying when you were asking me to write some things,
Yeah.
that it's very transient. So I've watched a lot of people leave, and then you watch a lot of small galleries who've struggled and just can't make it and leave. There aren't a lot of like alternative places to show artwork. Um, so yeah, I think I don't know what it is. I think maybe it's like living in the shadow of New York, and I kind of think it should try to be its own thing.
Totally, yeah.
It's
I
getting a
agree.
little bit better, I think. I think there's more. I think with the current, mayor, and it's definitely things are opening up more. But I still think probably a city thing too. I'm sure that New York has problems too. Like
Sure.
smaller galleries, it's really hard for them to compete and make it. So that's one of I think the main problems with Boston. I think, and it doesn't really there aren't that many. I don't know. There aren't that many grants for it. Individual
Right.
grants for artists,
Right.
unless you're an institution. So that's also I could say that is kind of a problem too.
And if you didn't get into like the big housing that was being put up in old factories and stuff in the 70s or maybe early 80s and stuff, you kind of missed that boat. Like most of us wouldn't be able to find live lofts that we could afford to live in, that kind of thing. Although I suppose there'll be a generational handoff, at some point. As folks, age and maybe move elsewhere to retire or whatever. I don't know, but it is difficult. I mean, between the lack of sort of available money, the fact that if one is first of all, here we're talking about visual artists, I think. Although please feel free to speak about all the different sort of arts scenes. I mean, that you touch upon film or touch on film and whatever, dance, music, whatever it is. I mean, we're talking to all different kinds of folks in the arts, But yeah, in visual arts, I mean, there's not a lot of money around, and the gallery scene is, and I have barely dipped my toe in it, but it's rough, and it requires you to do work that someone can nail to the living room wall or something, or if they have a big space, put some sculptural object somewhere, if they have some kind of giant foyer and fountains and stuff. This is not the kind of place I have lived in my life, but I mean, it's hard. And as you say, that there's competition between galleries, and there are certain dominant galleries that get a lot of the sales, and the bigger sales and stuff like that. The Shadow of New York thing, yeah, that's always puzzled me, because this is an interesting city. It's a so-called global city. We have people coming in from all over the place. We have all kinds of talent, both native talent and talent that moves here. And it's not a big city, but it's not small either. And there's plenty of people interested in the arts. There are significant art institutions and a lot of smaller ones. So why this thing? And I mean, yeah, I would agree it's getting better now, except for the pandemic.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely a setback.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I'm framing this as before and after, because like during the pandemic, I mean, we can talk about it, but I don't even know what to say. Like entire art forms have been sort of shoved aside. Theater has become very difficult. For example, like at Dig, we have a theater editor, but there's not much to do with our theater editor right now. Because yeah, there's some outdoor stuff, and there's some online stuff. It's not the same, like, and it's hard to sell tickets, for venues that are different than traditional venues and stuff. So anyway,
Also, art criticism. There isn't a lot of art criticism in this city, and it's really difficult when you have a show to get anybody. I mean, I can't tell you how many times and how much work I've tried to get like people to write about stuff when you actually do get a show. So,
Yeah.
I think that's another. I mean, we've got the Boston Globe, and then, you guys are doing that work, but it's really.
Oh no, it's been a bloodbath, and I mean we've basically, brought in out of the cold, talent that used to be working at other news outlets, like Greg Cook from WBUR immediately springs to mind. He now has another gig, and he writes for us. He writes for other folks. He has his own website and stuff. But there's very few. Forget about full time, just even long term gigs, whether they're part time or not, for news outlets. They're just not paying for arts criticism anymore. And I suppose if one asks producers and publishers, and I'm also a publisher, like why is that the case? They're going to give you kind of the pat excuses, like, oh, the internet, like that's a reason. Oh, well, the internet, of course, the internet. That doesn't speak to somebody, like the critics that we have, like others that we work with, or at least are friends with, like Bill Marks, who also has his own publication, The Arts Fuse, certainly worthy of support, where he's trying to keep this tradition going. People studying years and decades to really develop, a deep understanding of the stuff that they're reviewing and criticizing, and speaking knowledgeably about it, and being able to refer to all kinds of different, sources and influences and studies and whatever. It's not the same as people mouthing off on the internet that they don't like the fact that the sky in somebody's, landscape is green instead of blue. This is not. I mean, not to mock the general audience either. I mean, people, of course, especially in our postmodern age, have a right to their opinions or whatever. But I don't think it's the same thing as what good critics have done and built careers too.
Yep.
When they really like something, they can become effectively patrons and lead financial patrons to the talent. Think of the talent that would not have broken anywhere, had it not been for different kinds of media. Basquiat being discovered by Warhol would be like a classic example, like this kind of thing, right? So, with Warhol's publication specifically, I'm thinking of Interview, right? That kind of thing, as well as daily newspapers and all that. So yeah, that's bad. Yeah, that is bad. And yes, we are trying to keep it going, but we can't afford full-time staffers or even part-time staffers in the arts. And I function as arts editor because I have the degree in whatever in the background, but I don't have much of a budget for art reporting. So we do what we can do, and everybody's a contractor, but that's not a prescription for a long-term arts program in a news outlet.
No, and I think that's been the case in Boston for many years.
Oh, it has,
now, It's
15, 20 years. It's been going really badly downhill to the point where I think even larger news outlets now don't even think about it too much, except in a very instrumental way that, if they're commercial, their advertising department comes to them and says, like we want to sell ads to X, Y, and Z, like the Boston Ballet or something like that, although it's a nonprofit. And if it's WGBH or something, BUR that are nonprofit, there are different imperatives, but it's kind of similar, like who's donating, and how much do they care about the arts and, whatever. I mean, but it wouldn't be framed that way if you talk to people about it, but I think that's what ends up happening to some extent in practice. So I don't have, well, we're going to talk about, all right, well then let's talk about after the pandemic.
Okay.
You named a number of other problems too, so you might as well start talking about those as well. Just in terms of like how you think. And I don't mean to assume that the Boston art scene or scenes, as some people I've interviewed frame it, are all one big happy family, and that's another thing. That everyone's working in tandem and working together, but just broadly speaking, what do you think that people engaged in the scene might do to improve things, to make Boston a better art city, to make it better for artists?
Well, I think that like institutions could support Boston artists a lot more. I think that I think one of the problems too, and why maybe there's this sort of like longing for New York is that a lot of times Boston institutions will highlight New York artists over Boston artists.
It's true.
And I think there's a little bit of a lack of respect for Boston artists. And I also, so I think that should, at least there should be room for everyone. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Sure,
I have
I
no
totally
problem
do.
with showing, renowned artists at museums all over the place. But I think that every once in a while there could be more showcasing of sort of local artists, and I think all the institutions are sort of all the institutions are. That's a problem with all the institutions. At least that's what I see.
And do you mean, are you talking like, arts institutions or government or
I think
corporate
I'm talking
sector?
like museums, like showing, really like spending time to showcase Boston artists and like spending significant. I mean, when was the last time you saw a show at the Museum of Fine Arts that was just Boston artists? Or
only African American artists in recent memory, because of pressure from, Black Lives Matter and, communities of color in general. There's been some of that, but otherwise I can't actually.
Yeah,
right?
the ICA or like, and it doesn't have to be, all the time, but it would be great if they like maybe one show a year. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. But, or, just to sort of like, find, because a lot of great art started here. I mean, a lot of like all the New York artists started in Boston. A lot of them did. So,
and there's some stuff that's done with young people. I will say that, like with Artists for Humanity and other groups that work with younger artists. I mean, some of the institutions do come through on that level, but otherwise, no. And yes, that would be good. And I don't know what this thing about New York is with I don't know about Bostonians, but people in Boston, anyway, people who inhabit Boston who may or may not be from here. I don't quite get it. Like, I like it here. I think it's interesting. I
think it's like a small town. I think that's the thing about Boston. It's like things close early.
Well, that's a problem. Yeah.
It's a lot easier to live in. I mean, one reason I've never really wanted to live in New York is because it's like, I mean, I love New York. I love going to New York. It's really exciting, but it's also, it's overwhelming in a lot of ways too.
It was more like when I met my now wife in 1989, and she was down there, and we were going back and forth for 11 years before she moved up here. It was busier than now. I mean, gentrification and stuff is much further advanced down there. Which is hard to believe because we're incredibly expensive, and people, regular people, working people that used to live like downtown and stuff are now being pushed out again. The wealthy are not just content to seize the suburbs 50 years ago. Now they're seizing the city core too. But in New York, like Manhattan is like done, for all intents and purposes. The only artists I know there, again, like got sort of factory spaces back during the big social democratic era in New York in the 60s and 70s when they were spending money, and under Dinkins later in the 90s they were spending money. Now maybe they are to some extent, but the infrastructure, the buildings aren't even there to like have more housing in, and there's no land left. So I think people have been pushed further and further out into the boroughs, but also stuff like New York is like more lame now to me than I remember it certainly from the 80s when I was, like barely a teenager, and I went to college when I was 17 still, and I went down there and did stuff when I was 18, and it was more open all night. It was more happening in more parts of the city, and it's said that it was more dangerous or whatever. I didn't exactly have that experience, and I hung around the squats in the Lower East Side and all that kind of stuff too. Of course there's crime, whatever, but like, so I mean, yeah, that's true, but I don't know if it's as true as it used to be. And I wonder maybe if it's going to be possible would you think it would be a good thing for artists to put pressure on the city, and this has happened, I know before, to in the state, to have the T run later, to have stuff be open later.
I was surprised the T doesn't run later.
It's partially budgetary under
part
our
of it. I think it's also, years ago I went to Portland, and Portland does this thing, I think, where they have a building, and like a residential building, but the bottom floor has like space for has to have space for businesses, and they really support these small local businesses. And I think that would be a way for also the arts to sort of like flourish too. So I don't know. That's why I was wondering: is there a new model like?
There are zoning models that are being done even in places like where I'm now in Somerville, so Somerville is doing it with these big developments that are coming in. The question is it enough? Like number one, yes, local businesses, but what local businesses, right? What's going to make a square or whatever, like Union Square would be an example I would use here, more vibrant and have more art stuff going on. But in terms of specifically art stuff, there are set-asides for arts to some extent. And I'm not yet an expert on this, although I intend to become one over the next year or so. I'm going to be looking more closely at zoning alternatives. But it's still not what it should be, I think. I mean, I think there should be a lot more pressure put on developers that are making tons of money every which way to be forced to make more community spaces that can be used for the arts or purpose-built community art spaces. We had an opportunity with the East Cambridge Courthouse that Representative Mike Connolly, and I wrote a lot about this, and I was still living in Cambridge when this was happening, over a year ago now. We could have had this former Middlesex County, building that had devolved back to the state when Middlesex County basically was eliminated as a government, and then sort of the prison was left, and now they moved that prison out of that tower and elsewhere way too late because the place is filled with asbestos, right? So they had prisoners living there till 2014 in these horrible conditions and whatever. And the state workers were moved out of there I think 2008 is what I remember. And anyway, they need to gut rehab the place, get all the asbestos out of there. And Connolly was pushing for it to be, number one, public housing, and number two, significant community space and art space. And it was defeated in a really disgusting display of politics, which I wrote about, with the now mayor of Cambridge, who was a councilor then. Basically, she had the tie vote and had the opportunity to hold up big developers doing stuff instead of the government being forced to do stuff. Given how much desperate need there is for housing, not just by artists. Yeah. Like Cambridge had over 10,000 people and still does on its public housing rolls, and that's just one city. Somerville is the same. Boston's worse, and that housing isn't there. And even if that tower had been made into housing, it would have been like 200 units, if that, So whatever. I'm just saying, like, there are opportunities, but they get missed. The clarion call of big money and its the ability of big money to throw its weight around, to distort the public process, and to have a person like Mayor Siddiqui just take a dive on behalf of these developers and then get rewarded for it by being elected, being the top vote getter among city councilors in that weird Cambridge system, and then being elected mayor by her peers. That's how it works there.
Oh, I didn't realize.
It's like, really? So this person betrayed like all of her original backers, like the working people of Cambridge, with this kind of thing, and people that would like to live in Cambridge who are working people and artists and stuff, and now we're going to have some big corporate development, maybe, because like who knows what's going to happen now. So like, yeah, the giveaway of public property that could be used for public purposes is disgusting and has been going on for decades and decades. So
I mean, I love Mass Mocha. Why can't we have like a Mass Mocha close to Boston? You know what I mean? It's always so far to, that would be fantastic.
That's an interesting example too, right? Because when that place was GE, and I happen to have written a lot about how horrible General Electric has been in Massachusetts, when our state and Boston city government was giving away the store to this giant company because they wanted to move here, and it all fell apart, but a lot of money was thrown at them for no reason, right? And Mass Mocha used to be a GE factory, right? It was the powerhouse, the unionized sort of employer for that whole northwestern region of Massachusetts. And when GE pulled out of there, this is one reason I attacked them so hard, as they pulled out of Fitchburg, as they pulled out of Pittsfield, and left a lot of these places environmental wastelands, right? And they've mostly pulled out of Lynn, right? Et cetera, et cetera. The community's left with these hulking spaces, and then it's replaced with an art museum that is great if you're an artist. I mean, of course, I love the museum, and I have friends that
Mm-hmm.
do shows there, and whatever. But like, um, it isn't.
Has it helped the community at
It's
all?
not the way that it was pitched, you know, and like they just don't have enough jobs out there.
I see.
So I mean, yeah, it's a great example as an artist, and sure, I would love to see something like a MoCA around here, right? I mean, I would that the ICA was that, right?
The ICA, I love the ICA.
Me too.
And I remember when it was
On Boylston and yeah.
yeah. But I'm always surprised it's not a bigger space.
True.
It
Very
doesn't
true.
feel big enough to me for like an Institute of Contemporary Art.
I think they do a lot of educational work, which I respect, and I
Yeah.
think they use space for that. But it's true. It's basically like 2.5 galleries,
Yeah.
sort of.
It doesn't feel that much bigger than the space in Boylston Street. That
Right.
really like.
Yeah.
I think they have more storage space, so they can now like hold a permanent
Well, right.
collection.
And
So
they
that
have
makes
higher ceilings.
sense, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have
It's
a
a beautiful
theater.
building. It's a great building.
I love it. Yeah, it's a great place to do photography for that matter,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean that's all true. Now what about, and you touched on this too, like okay, so government, so city government, state government. We don't know about federal government yet for a while, but we'll assume it'll get a little bit better with
Federal
Biden.
government.
Yeah, government TM, yeah.
Yeah.
But how? I mean, certainly grants, right? Grants is kind of a no-brainer, right? And
Yeah.
certainly leveraging companies and big nonprofits as city government and state government to give more grants as well would also be good, right? But what about? I mean, I don't know. It's my colleague Suren Mudliar always chastises me for kind of walking over this line. Like when I was doing this attempt to organize, which I've mentioned in other videos, artists with other artists. When I had just gotten my MFA, it was called Mass Creative Workers, and we were trying to sort of restart the Boston Artists Union scene of the 1970s. Essentially, right?
I don't know anything about that. That sounds really interesting.
I'm sure you would have enjoyed it. I wish we had met like 5 years ago when I was trying to do this. And I'm not saying I won't try to at least help again. Like I haven't produced any art in like 3 years because I'm running a newspaper and at least not art qua art. But I mean Suren was always like, look, artists are certainly in general working people. Although of course there are rich folks that are artists. And okay, what are you going to do? It's not like. No disrespect to them, but they don't necessarily need what everybody else needs. But like he would say, like, do you want jobs programs, for example, public jobs programs, which we don't have right now in general, right? That would benefit specifically artists, like privilege artists over others. And I would say no. I don't want to privilege. Well, go ahead. Why don't you take that one?
Well, I don't know about that, but also there's so many stories of corporations ripping off artists.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice if like creatives were paid. I mean, like I have friends who write for large magazines who are not paid. I've like you see tons of stories of large corporations like just recreating artists' work and not paying them for it.
Nice. I haven't actually heard that much about
like,
that, but yeah.
Like, why is it so hard to like pay artists? Do you know what I mean? Like what's at like a decent wage?
I think it's easy to screw us over. I think that's more like what especially if you're a big company, but it's not just big companies. And you had this great line that I used as the subtitle of the print version of your interview, right? And I've certainly heard it around. I was a labor organizer for a long time for workers in the same kind of jobs I've worked my whole life, which are bad contingent jobs, or as people now call them, precarious jobs, just bad jobs, temp jobs, contract jobs, day labor. And, we were, always trying to find ways to to get people paid. Like I was the director of the National Writers Union in Boston when the union was bigger. We were trying to organize freelance writers nationally and then come up with contracts that we could enforce by having enough freelancers organized to withhold labor to some extent or do other things labor traditionally does. And it worked somewhat and didn't work in other ways. But, and that was sort of part of the idea with Mass Creative Workers, to at least have collective organizations that will go to bat for each other, and just make a stink, right? And make demands. And of course, power exceeds to nothing without a demand, right? But you said, that like, basically we can't eat prestige. Is what you said. You're like,
I always say die. They always offer you exposure, and I always say you can die from exposure.
That's right, which is a wonderful way of putting it. Yeah. So like and that's absolutely true. It's especially true for younger artists. You know, and I always, and as with younger journalists, with any creatives, and generally journalists are creatives, not always, but a lot, certainly ours are. And you know, I tell them like, we can swear on this, by the way, don't take shit. You cannot just let, you know, publishers or curators or corporations or whoever walk all over you. You know, and try to get stuff in writing. You know, don't do handshakes. Like if you're doing a contract, make sure you got it in writing. You know, and that's some basic stuff. But then it's like, get your friends together. You know, like put pressure on. Talk to the press. Like certainly at DigBoston, if you come to us and say someone's trying to make me, you know, like just do this for credit or something, and it's not at all an institution that is just some poor, barely existent nonprofit or something that just doesn't have any money. That's completely different. You know, that's voluntary. This is like involuntary servitude. Like, do it, and we're not going to pay you, but we're going to like tell people you're cool. And if you don't do it, then nobody knows who you are, so we don't care. Well, that's not much of a, you know. So just exposing that would be nice, you know. And do you think? I mean, I don't know. What do you think about the prospects for getting artists to work together politically?
I think, well, I don't know. One of the things that I've really sort of like been struggling with lately is sort of being so isolated, and I tend to be more isolated as an artist than I think I should be. I don't know. I kind of imagine sort of, I don't know if it would be an artist collective or just this idea that like if we could band together and maybe that there's strength in numbers that we could advocate for ourselves. I also think it's easier. I don't know. As an artist, it's also sometimes difficult to talk about your own art. It's maybe easier for other. It's always easier for me to talk about another artist than myself. I don't know why that is exactly, but I'm just wondering if there are ways, sort of like, to create more of a community, and maybe that's something that we as artists can maybe do ourselves too.
Yeah, I think we have to. I don't think anyone else is going to do it. It was, you know, look, I mean, on the one hand, I think that most artists' process is pretty, if not solitary, you know, it's a small number of people working together maybe, you know. It gets a little bit crazy, unless your art lends itself to this, to try to work with a whole ton of people, right? I mean, some people do that. But then this political work, you know, this economic work is kind of a different thing. And I don't automatically assume that just because someone has kind of a individual process that they are, you know, sort of very private people and they're just not going to do stuff with other folks. You know, I think many will. But what I found trying to do it 5 years ago and 4 years ago, trying to do this group around here is, you know, it's essentially labor organizing, and all labor organizing is like herding cats, but it's especially true of artists, precisely for what you're saying. People are kind of doing their own thing, and that's part of the deal with a lot of art, as I said. So, you know, you can't, like, so what would happen is this, and again, this isn't just artists, but it was particularly artists that I noticed this with. You know, you first do a public event. So I did this public event with Tim Devon and Matt Calliner, who you may or may not know, and they're Somerville people, and it was called Getting By in Boston. So there's a Facebook group of the same name. Anybody who's, you know, who wants to check it out can check it out. You should certainly get on it. And we were basically saying, how do we as artists get by in Boston, you know? And out of that, we got about 100 people to an initial event. That was a nice turnout. So then I'm like, okay, well, I kind of know how to put together organizations of people to do stuff collectively. So let me get some of the other activisty types and start to do that. So what I saw over like 4 major meetings, you know, over the course of months, is that the numbers just go down. And when I start talking about nonprofit structure and talk about how we're going to vote or whatever, and you know, less and less people. And I'm not trying to belabor things. I'm just trying to get ducks in rows and then move along and do stuff, do events, do lobbying, do whatever we're going to do, right? And then see if we want a group that might have a budget, that might have some staff time. Like, that was not what we were trying to do. We were doing a volunteer organization at first, right? And then seeing if it had any legs. Well, it kind of didn't, No,
I've heard that before too. What do you think that, I'm going to turn this interview around, but why do you think that's the case?
Well, we already discussed some of it. It's kind of the nature of how a lot of artists, run their lives.
A lot of us are working. Like, I work close to full-time job.
Exactly.
So, you've got kids, and that's some of the things I'm thinking about.
Real
too.
life is absolutely true.
Yeah.
In this era, everybody's working too much. Again, unless you're wealthy, and scraping along to get by, whether you're nominally, middle class, or you're like officially, whatever that means, working class. If you don't own some means of production or whatever, then you're a worker. And you said in your text, that you're like so many artists, you're working on another gig or gigs, right? And you only can fit in your art on the side. So then you're supposed to add politics on top of this. That's right. Yes. So you interviewed yourself. That's correct, I think. And beyond that, it's daunting. I mean, I think, especially in this era, people have the sense that the United States is much less a democracy or even a republic than an oligarchy now. And they, like me and probably you and many other people, they've seen the studies showing that most people's opinion literally counts for nothing in terms of how the power structure comports itself and moves forward and does what it wants, right? So, I mean, it seems futile. And in many cases, it, at least in the moment, is futile to undertake collective action for redress of grievances, right? But then you see when bigger movements flare up, like Black Lives Matter, periodically, and things change. Like the one time, until this journalism commission bill I'm working on through our nonprofit that doesn't cost the state anything and that will basically examine what the state government might do to help journalism outlets like Dig and others, right? And that may pass. It's stuck in conference committee. We'll see if that gets out. But it actually passed the House. Like, I've never gotten any bill even close to that far before in the legislative process after decades of trying. The closest was right at the beginning of my tenure as any kind of grassroots lobbyist. 1997, there was a Teamster Strike, huge one, right? Over contingent work, over bad jobs, over the destruction of unionized jobs that were full-time and permanent, more or less, at UPS, turning them into temp jobs and part-time jobs and day labor jobs and contract jobs. And it was a pretty successful strike. They got a lot of their demands. It ended up not working out over years because corporations have armies of lawyers and they just keep going at the workers and going at the workers and trying to break the unions and then breaking the union, But at that time, it was pretty good. So I had a proto group with this older labor activist named Tim Costello, who's sadly passed away now. And it was an omnibus bill for temp and other contingent workers that would have meant that if we were a temp or part-time worker or contractor working right next to somebody else doing the same job who was considered permanent and full-time, we would have to have the same benefits. We would have to get the same pay. Because of the strike, Governor Cellucci, a Republican, right? Pretty decent guy by today's standards, was meeting with me and Tim and others, labor leaders. Like, I wasn't a labor leader, I was like a minor, kid, but like, I was a communications expert and everything. And he was like ready to sign this bill. We believe that but the strike ended like the next day. And therefore the legislature did not feel the pressure to push it through. I think Finneran might have even been in power then, but like, another week, we think, if the strike had gone on another week, we think that it would have passed. Because, and that's the importance of extra parliamentary politics. In other words, outside electoral politics. Part of the thing is that most artists and most people feel like politics is something elected officials do. And it's like, yeah, but no, you shouldn't leave it to the professionals. You got to get in the game.
especially local politics. I'm really guilty of like really following national politics, and like when it
Right.
comes time to figure, it's really hard to get that.
And
It's
I write
funny,
about local
get
politics, right? So it's like, yeah.
yeah, how hard it is to get that information. I'm like, I go vote. I'm like, ooh, city council. I don't know who to vote for, you know. And so I think that like being more active in local politics probably would be helpful also.
It is. There's a lot that can be done at the local level to help artists. It's just that people have to understand, though, that, money just isn't there. It's not like the federal government. The federal government can literally print money, but the right wing exists basically to stop that from ever happening. Even when it would be a good thing to do, right? And at the state level, there's more money. Or I'm sorry, not. I mean, there's more money
Yes.
than local, but less than federal.
Yeah.
And then at the local level, it really depends. A city like Cambridge, where I lived for so long, over a quarter century overall, has tons of money, and they, the power structure there, which is like Harvard and MIT and the biotechs and whatever other major companies are in Cambridge, they kind of make sure that the powerful interests are not taxed much locally or otherwise. And I mean, so that kind of pressuring municipalities to do the taxation they can do on the wealthy and the powerful would help.
Yeah,
It wouldn't
totally.
solve every problem, but it would help. Like if the issue is like we're afraid to float bonds for a community space for arts that we don't have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Somerville is actually building one over in the Brick Bottom area,
Mm-hmm.
and but it's kind of stuck because of the pandemic. But many other cities and towns are not doing anything, right? Then taxing those that can afford it more can ensure that there's money that can be directly granted. That you don't just
Yeah.
float bonds, or maybe it's easier to float bonds because you have more in the kitty.
Yeah.
A city like Cambridge has this I mean, the rating systems for cities, bonds and stuff, like saying that Cambridge is like fiscally Moody is rated at like AAA plus. That's wonderful for financiers and stuff and for wealthy people and but it's not like if a city's not spending its money and therefore has a high finance rating, what does that say about it as a city? How is it serving the people that live in the city? So that's all I got to say. I mean, right now, I mean, what do you have
Yeah.
to say? I don't know. It's like,
Well, I don't know. I think those systemic problems are important. Health insurance is important.
oh yeah,
You know, the things that we're dealing on the larger level, I think, are really important to artists, and that's um, workers' rights. I mean, as a worker, you have very few rights. That's something I've experienced in the past, and all those things. Really, I think if we have more, we have a lot more security in those areas would definitely help artists and thrive. And I mean, health insurance is a huge thing.
It is.
As far as like determining, what jobs you take and where you go and what you do, and I think those kind of things are really important. Paying people living wages. I think, like you said, like when companies come in, they should pay taxes. Why are we giving these
yeah,
crazy tax breaks to companies that don't pay their workers, and then their workers are on like, they don't pay for their health care. And they're on like, I think, what is it, Walmart is like a lot of their workers on like government assistance.
welfare and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
It's what that's doing is, as they say, socializing the risks and privatizing the profit.
Yeah.
Or socializing in this case, the costs, right, of having employees, right, in the service of more profit. So, in other words, the government will take care of it. We're not going to pay the government like the taxes like we should. We're going to offshore all our profit and play all these games that are allowed to be played, But yeah, I mean, we're in a capitalist system, and it's rigged to the top right now. So it's clearly time to send the pendulum the other way,
Yeah.
Like, I'm a socialist, right? I mean, broadly speaking, and I
Me
can
too.
get into specifics. I'm, on the libertarian side of socialism. I'm not just trying to solve everything by nationalizing everything. I think that doesn't work in most sectors. But I mean, look, it's like I think more things need to be decommodified. I think more things need to be taken off the market. Especially at least saying, all right, people can still have their private houses and whatever, and make money in certain sectors by gambling in the stock market. But stuff like healthcare, that should not be on the market. Like stuff like basic housing that's decent. Like in Europe, they have something called social housing that I write about a lot. In cities like Vienna, that had a strong socialist movement prior to the Nazis smashing it, and then afterwards too, to some extent. They built in the 20s and 30s vast amounts of very excellent public housing that they call social housing. They're the ones who kind of, I think, invented this thing. And like to this day, I think over 60% of the Viennese population lives in this kind of housing.
Wow.
Whether they're like upper middle class, working class, probably not very wealthy people, but some of these things are in great areas like downtown where everybody wants to be, and they're kept up beautifully. Okay, so if we're going to build public housing, we have to keep it nice. What happened in the U.S. is we built it, and then the movements that caused it to be built were pushed back, and then you get this game which the current right wing loves to play. Let's defund. The game is let's defund everything. And then also, let's only put the poorest of the poor in this housing. That happened in England as well. England had social housing after World War II. And much of it was very nice. A lot of it was even village-like. And as the governments got more conservative, culminating in Thatcher, and then the neoliberals of the Blair administration, they started shoving just the poorest into these places and then defunding them. And then everyone's like, look at all those criminals and horrible people, and people of color, like living over there. And we don't want to live. That's terrible. Public housing is awful. It's like communism. It's like, okay, whatever, So, I mean, if we're going to do this stuff, there's got to be public pressure to do it properly. Now, artists, I think artists need to remember that I think one nice thing about postmodernism, I have many criticisms of it in the arts and in general, right? And we're kind of getting past all that now in the left, politics, in left politics at least, I think. But again, there's another balance, between kind of more materialist views and more, what one might call romantic views, or in the case of postmodernism, like where you can never find your feet because nothing is real, everything is contingent. All right, fine, wonderful. But one good thing, that came out of postmodernism is that when people like you or I decide to form groups of artists to, again, redress grievances that we have in the real world, I think when I look at the older movements on the left that do this among artists, I'm very interested in stuff, not just the early sort of socialist and communist period, 100 years ago and to mid-century, but I mean the 60s, the 70s were a big time for this stuff all over the world. And I think then the assumption was that your art had to be quote unquote political. And I think that might be something that frightens, you can tell me what you think, please, but I think that has frightened artists away from political organizing because they assume that like these groups are going to dictate what they can and cannot do. And I don't want to do that. Ever. I think
I've never been like I don't know if I'm not, maybe tangentially political, but not directly political because it just doesn't interest me that much as far as artwork. I'm definitely more interested in the personal and the visual, I think, too. So, the other thing too is like in the Midwest, I have a friend who's an artist in the Midwest, and there's a lot more grants. I think they come from sort of a background where they had to like bring the arts in because they were so isolated. And I know that also when he applies for a grant, one thing I was talking to him, he told me that when he applies for a grant, he gets feedback if he doesn't get the grant. Which I was like, oh my God, that would help so much. If like I've like applied for the Mass Cultural Council grant for years and years, and I've never gotten feedback. It'd be wonderful to get to know like what I could do better as far as that.
It would be nice actually if you wrote a little opinion piece that we could publish on that. Just talking to. I can do it too, of course, but but I would like other people to do it than just me because they'll be like, oh, it's Jason, whatever. But you're right, and I'm about to be a judge on the Somerville Arts Council, sort of grant thing, and that guy Matt Callender I was mentioning is the chair of the Somerville Arts Council. Like, that's worth. I think they may already do that here, but I need to double check. I'm new to this here, but if they don't, and I know one or two people that.
I think he's from Minnesota. My friend's from Minnesota, and he was saying that they actually film the panels, so you can go and watch them. So it's totally transparent. I was
Very
like,
nice.
That to me, like, why not do that?
That's
like,
great.
Why keep it like this weird sort of like secret?
having done so much, so applied for so many grants for so many projects over the decades, you are completely correct. It would really help. Like, yeah, we were arbitrary and capricious. See, like you can see, but
Well, so many things in the art world are like that, and I think one of the things. So I've actually done a couple interviews. I've been interviewing a few artists because I feel like I've been an artist for 20 years, and I don't know how the world works still.
right,
Like I
right.
still haven't like sort of figured out. Um, uh, and I think too, it's like I know we all need to make money too, but I'm wondering if we can separate. I don't know. I'm interested in this idea of like success and failure too, as something I've always been
Yeah.
interested in, and like maybe we need to separate ourselves a little bit from this idea that the only way we measure success is monetarily too. So,
Absolutely.
but we all need money to live too. So there's sort of like it's sort of like keyed into that.
I mean, this is why I look at, I also, whatever my criticisms of like supposedly communist countries back in the day, starting with Russia, they did some really interesting stuff in these countries all the way along. It wasn't just at the beginning during the sort of salad days of the revolution when it was still more democratic and stuff like that. But later too, like they like I don't know how much people care about this stuff. Sorry for I'll just indulge me for a moment as a Marxist. Let me just like I think that even though there are many critics from the left, and I've certainly been one that said, a lot of these countries that call themselves communist were essentially what's called state capitalist, like welfare states basically. And yeah, they had state-run enterprises, and it was planned from above. But I mean, it could have been a right-wing dictatorship. There are plenty of examples of those that do the same thing, like Singapore would be an example, that for decades had this, guy that was a communist when he was young, and then he became more conservative. But he was like interested in his city-state above all. And to ensure that he retained control of it and independence from the colonial powers and everything, I think it can be said, he delivered a lot of the same stuff that a socialist or communist government would have delivered. Public housing, massive public housing. Like Singapore is another place where like 80% in that case of people live in public housing, and it's good, and lots of public school that was really good, and all kind, everybody has jobs, like all this stuff. So okay, they did that, but they did something else too, even with the horrible dictatorial aspects of pretty much all these countries, and the fact that horrible crimes against humanity were committed, which is something that the broad left still has to deal with. If they're wondering why everyone's not rushing forward to be, like even a Swedish type socialist, let alone a Russian style communist, or something I would consider to be an actual communist, which usually people that look a lot different in how they comport themselves, a lot more like a me, let's say, than like a Stalin, but for all that, like when I look at I exercise late at night. I love to watch YouTube videos because there's so many documentaries on so many things that I'm interested in. When I watch documentaries about how the Soviets ran their housing, right? Yeah, there were all these problems, which were very serious problems, and the country had to be democratized. It would have been nice if they could have retained some sort of socialist economy too, rather than what they got, which was outright oligarchs, right? But they didn't build their housing the way we build our housing. They built their housing around where people worked and where the hospitals were and where the power plants were, the telephone exchange, all the art stuff, movie theaters. They planned it so that towards the end of the Soviet Union, just a regular worker, didn't have to walk more than like a kilometer for anything. And then there was lots of public transportation between those zones and throughout those zones. Well, in the arts, there was a lot of interesting stuff too. They did not have a commodified art system. So it's worth asking, well, then why did people do art? Especially when artists were often persecuted. They would do it, there'd be some funding for it, maybe even if it was an art club at their workplace. Even if factories, they would foster the arts in the factories, which I think is wonderful, right? But however they did it, why did artists want to do it? Why would you think an artist would do it, regardless of not being paid?
I can only speak personally. I'm compelled to do it. I can't
Yeah,
not do it. I've
that's
tried not
number
to do it,
one.
but I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just ultimately like whether or not I can make a living at it is irrelevant because it's something I need to do, and it gives my life, it gives my life so much meaning and purpose.
I've had a lot of, more than one, I should say, people that I've interviewed in this series, talk about, I ask everybody, I can ask you too, but I'll just tell you in advance that people have been saying, like, I'm like, why should people that aren't artists support the arts?
Uh-huh.
And people have generally been saying, because we bring good things to life, to use the bad GE slogan, because, because they're saying as artists, we make our communities nicer. We help people reflect on the zeitgeist, on the spirit of the age, like this, like, do you have an answer for this question,
I
apropos
mean,
of what you just said?
I don't. It, I guess the question to be turned on its head. Can you imagine a world without it?
No.
Like, what would the world be like without it? To me, it would be this gray sort of like, story like The Giver or something like that, where we're all like, I mean, it brings so much
Yeah.
writing and music and visual art and movies and popular culture. It's all connected. You can't. It doesn't exist without art. You know what I mean? It feeds. Fine art feeds into all those things. I
Yeah.
think at least. And I mean, if you look at stuff like MTV or like music videos, MTV's, and now I'm really dating myself, but music videos, I mean, like that came from experimental film,
Yep.
that like
Yep.
those things feed into our popular culture. So, and I just think they bring so much to life. That's what makes life worth living, is like the pursuit of things that are outside of ourselves.
Yeah, agree. Could not agree more. Um, any final thoughts? I mean, we're at about an hour now. Is there anything else you want to tell the folks out in Folkland? Although, not that we get that many views yet, but
No, I think that it's just great. It's great to have a conversation about where we are and where we're going, and I hope we can be in a better place, after the pandemic. I hope that people's lives have I hope that people have woken up a little bit. I'm a little worried that they haven't. That once it's over, we'll sort of sink back into our complacency. But I have some hope that we won't.
well, your hope gives me hope, and hopefully to everybody out there as well. Michael Lewy, thank you so much for being on Better Boston Arts, and we'll have to follow up with you after the pandemic, and some of the other folks I've been talking to too. And your website again is what?
It's www.michaellewy.com,
Okay.
and my last name is spelled Lewy.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We'll see y'all later. Bye, folks.
All right, thank you.
I'm not waving in the right place. Bye. And just hang around with me for a second here. I'm just ending.